Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Beyond Sunday podcast, where we desire to take the conversation deeper. I'm on virtually today, but that's okay. I'm on today with Shreya. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, ready for this one. This will be a good one. So before we dive into the conversation, take a look at this video. All right, as we dive into the conversation, Shreya, what was the big idea for this week from Sunday scriptures we were in? Yeah, what was our premise?
Yeah, well, we've been following Jesus through the book of Luke, and so we're in chapter 18 this week, which Jesus gives a story of a widow who models persistence, I guess. And so this week we talked about this persistence for specifically for justice, and so he tells this story to his disciples about this widow who uh, it has been a victim of injustice, and she comes to this judge who is not a just and fair and good judge. The text says that he doesn't fear God or care about people, and so she comes to him, and he's not enacting justice, and so she just keeps coming, and so she's super persistent to the point where finally the judge, who is not a good judge, finally he's like, okay, I'll just give you what you want. I'm tired of being bothered by you. And so she wears him down. And so then Jesus calls out, like, if this unjust judge even will enact justice, then how much more will a good father, a good God, do the same? And then there's this little question at the end, where Jesus, after he calls out, like, this good God that we serve, won't he then also enact justice, and this call out for us to be persistent? But then Jesus asks the question of, when the Son of Man returns, how many will he find on the earth who have faith? And so that's kind of the text. That's the main text, at least, that we were in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some other ones that we were touching on. We touched on Genesis 32, which is Jacob wrestling with this man, and he sends all his flock and wives and family across before he's about to meet up with his brother, who he hasn't seen since he tricked him in getting the birthright before. And after doing that and swindling his brother out of that, he left. And so this is the first time he's about to encounter him. But before he does, he sends everyone across and then begins out of nowhere, it seems, right? The text just doesn't give like, and somebody approached him and he saw him coming. No, it then sends everyone across and then bam, he starts wrestling with this man. And in this wrestling match, right, he's like holding on to this man, Jacob is, and won't let go up until like dawn breaks, all through the night. Apparently dawn breaks and the man's like, let go of me. And Jacob's like, I will not until you bless me. I mean, it's also in that passage that Jacob gets a new name, says your name is now Israel. And again, it's more of a promise and a covenant or identity spoken over Jacob in that space. But like we were drawing conclusions or connections from Jacob's wrestling to this widow who's so persistent before the judge. Like, I will not stop coming to you to ask for justice to be served or to be administered, and where Jacob is like, I'm not letting go until I see this blessing. But we started in Psalm 121, and this was this reminder of where are we looking for our help? In the way that the widow is looking for the judge who should be administering justice, should be fearing God and caring for man. And so even in the text, the parable that Jesus shares is like, this is not someone who is fit for that position. And yet they find
Mhm.
themselves sitting there. Um, and in Psalm 121, it's like, I lift my eyes up to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And it's in this place of uh, redirecting where I think our focus can be, who I'm looking for help from. Not that the widow shouldn't be going to the judge to administer justice and fear God and care for man, but that God and even Jesus in the parable says, look, if the judge is finally going to offer justice, how much more will God offer justice for those that He cares for His chosen ones? And yeah, the other thing that struck me in the midst of Sunday was in this parable, here's a widow who's advocating for herself. And in Jesus's time, there are laws that they are following, should follow, that are written in the Torah that give widows priority, give widows extra a place or a prominence of care and of like you have the ear of those who are in charge if you have a need, right? And it's written into the law that they are supposedly following. And so here in this parable, this widow's having to advocate for herself, to
Mhm.
go to the judge and say this injustice has taken place. Where's the justice? Please administer it. And that in the moment on Sunday, I'm like, and that's not where she should be. A community should come
Mhm.
and either help in the area of need or advocate for her if it doesn't exist. And that's the part of community that I didn't, we don't read in this parable that should have probably existed.
Yeah. Was interesting because I listened to your message and I heard you call that out. For me, what struck was so in the context, in the cultural context of God's community, of God's people, yes, the widows and orphans should be cared for, and that's not here. We're not seeing that certainly. But in the general context of the time, in the culture, the widow wouldn't have a voice really in the broader context outside of God's people. That's what set them apart, right?
Correct.
And so even in that, that's what was sitting for me on Sunday. And I guess not knowing Jesus isn't super specific if what the specific context of this widow and judge is. But in the broader space of the cultural context, this this is a woman who doesn't have a voice in culture as a whole, because she's a woman, because she's a widow. So she is the marginalized. That's a reason God tells his people to care for them and to call to come around them. And yet, even with all of that, her persistence shows up. And so for me, that was like in those spaces and those places where we feel like we don't have a voice or we are just one voice, right? So we can look at the world around us and see like there is no shortage of injustice in the world around us. And it actually doesn't matter what your beliefs are or how you vote or where you sit politically. I even said on Sunday, like if I asked you right now to make me a list of things that you think are wrong in the world, nobody would have a hard time writing things down. So it actually doesn't matter. But we can look at that list of things we would write down and we can feel really helpless. Like this list is too big and I'm one person or I don't have a voice or whatever. And we see a woman who her persistence does make a difference. And whether she should have been there or she shouldn't, regardless of what the context is specifically that Jesus is giving us in God's community or otherwise, the persistent voice of somebody who really doesn't or shouldn't have a voice in that space does make a change and does enact justice. And so there's something in that, I guess, for me in those spaces of like, we actually don't get to use that as an excuse to say, well, I don't have a voice, or I'm
Right.
just one person, or it feels too big, because that's what this shows. Like persistence made a difference.
Right, and willing to keep coming back, even when the uh, being dismissed or the answer is no. Um, but I sense conviction in this widow, right? I have to read between the lines, but I sense a conviction to continue to keep coming back to the judge. Here is the one who ought to offer justice. There's conviction to keep coming. Otherwise, if there's no conviction or persistence, like, no, they said no, and I'm probably not going to get anywhere. I guess I'll just move on. I'll endure the injustice. I'll just endure it and you know make do with this being the reality. And maybe that's the piece. I'll make do with this being the norm when actually this is brokenness. This is injustice. This is not the way that God's designed, or this doesn't look like God's kingdom come. And so I'm going to
Hmm.
keep pursuing. I'm going to keep wrestling. I'm going to keep showing up until I do see God's
Hmm.
God's kingdom coming in this place where brokenness is restored to made whole, where hopelessness is renewed and restored with hope, where chaos is replaced with peace and shalom and calm. And like, I'm not going to stop and I'm not going to sit in a place resigned to the fact that it's not going to change and this will just be how it is.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's the piece of like it really then starts on my knees. I
Yeah.
can keep showing up and calling attention to it, but honestly, I'll get weary. I'll get tired if I'm just keep showing up. But I get strengthened when I come in on my knees, or I've been on my knees. I get strengthened to continue to come and return to those places that there is brokenness or hopelessness or just doesn't look like God's kingdom has come.
Yeah. Well, and I guess that's the other piece for me in that last um, part of what Jesus says. So yes, absolutely starts on our knees. It starts with the prayer. I mean, he calls that out, right? His chosen people who cry out to him day and night. And this is one instance in scripture. I mean, we read this all throughout scripture that the prayers of God's people are powerful. There's power in prayer, right? And persistence. And I mean, Jesus uses other parables even to drive that point home. So this is like that absolutely it starts in communion with God and in prayer and in petitioning and persistence in prayer. But I also think there's a piece of maybe the next natural step of that is that when I'm empowered in prayer, when I'm coming to God persistently, consistently in prayer, and I'm being filled with His Spirit, then there's a power and authority that I'm given in that changes the way I show up, and not in a what you just said, where it's like I'm not just showing up to call out, because that's unfortunately maybe
Sure.
what has
Right.
become the thing, right?
Yeah.
Christians are known for calling out
Yeah. Yeah,
whatever
I
we
see this
decide
as
to
wrong,
do,
guys. You're doing it wrong.
right? But actually, it means I show up differently. And that was the piece that hit for me, because what Jesus says at the end, how many will He find on earth who have faith? And the message paraphrase says how much of that kind of persistent faith will the Son of Man find on earth when He returns? But the faith word, and here's the Greek word for the
Here we
day.
go. Here we
Um,
go. Take us to
the
school.
the Greek word there is pistis, which is this belief that moves you to an action, right? This is the same word that Jesus uses in Mark chapter 1, where we pull out the whole idea of kairos, which we talk about on this podcast every week. We talk about in our churches regularly. And in Mark chapter 1, what Jesus is saying is like, hey, there's a significant moment in time happening right now. God's kingdom is breaking through. He's trying to get your attention. You need to, he says, repent and believe. The believe word there is the same word that's used for faith here. This pistis, or the root word of it, is the
Hmm.
same. And in that, it's this idea of like not just a head knowledge or a head kind of a faith, but it's a faith or a belief so deep in me that it changes, it forces me to act. And so I always like, for me, the illustration of like I believe so deeply that the sun will rise tomorrow. Like I believe it so deep within myself that I will make preparations. I'm going to act as though the sun is going to rise tomorrow because I believe that to be true. So that means I'm going to make plans in my schedule. I'm going to make sure my house has food or whatever. Like those things come out of a deep belief or a faith that the sun's going to come up tomorrow. And that's the kind of thing I think Jesus is talking about here, which is like, um, believe that justice will come, believe that God is the good judge. And so, yes, coming to him and petitioning, but does that belief also change the way I show up in the world?
Mhm.
And does it change what?
Or prepare to show up, right? In my preparation as well as my presence in the world. My
Y- Yeah, yeah. Well, and just there's a quietness. Sometimes I think we think justice is loud, and sometimes I guess it is. But there's a quietness, there's a quiet justice. If I show up and look like Jesus in the spaces that I'm showing up, and if the things that I'm doing in my life, if I'm focused on God in every space that I show up today, let me look like you, there's a quiet justice in that because in every space that I show up looking like Jesus, I'm standing in contrast to the injustice of the world that doesn't look like Jesus.
Mhm.
And so I think that for me, because we also went to Jeremiah 29, which is a every time I read this passage, there's like a conviction, but in a like a good way. Because God's talking to his people and they're in exile and they're crying out. In fact, we were in Isaiah 40 last week and we have been as a district for a while now.
Yeah.
But in Isaiah 40, God's people who are in exile are calling out this, like, you must have forgotten about us. Like, this is really bad. We're oppressed. We're displaced from where we're supposed to be. And in Jeremiah, God's talking to them and he tells them, like, here's what you actually need to do. I want you to work for the peace and prosperity of the place I put you. Yes, it's not your home. And yes, your poor decisions landed you there. And yes, you're experiencing injustice and oppression and whatever. What I want you to do is I actually want you to work to make the place I've put you good, to
Yeah.
make it and the prosperity of that place. And he says, he calls out prayer as well. Pray to the Lord because the welfare of the place that I've put you is going to determine your welfare. And he says very specifically, like, build houses,
Yeah.
plant gardens,
Gardens. Yeah.
like, and
Harvest
and
its fruit.
that feels like such a quiet act of justice to me. Like, that makes no sense. If I am in exile and I'm being oppressed and I've been taken from my land and essentially I'm kidnapped and enslaved, the last thing I want to do is make the place that I'm at
Yeah.
nice and good
Bearable.
and yeah, and pray for its peace and prosperity.
Yeah.
That feels like a quiet act of justice. And that's for me, and in this whole series of formation, that's what landed for me on Sunday was like part of being persistent. Yes, it is a hitting my knees and a crying out, calling out the injustice around me. But part of being persistent is actually letting myself be formed to look like Jesus so that every space I show up in pushes against the injustice, the brokenness in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, the things that are opposite to the kingdom and
Yeah.
being kingdom people, we get to show up and enter into that, offer it up where it doesn't exist. Where there's darkness, we show up as the light of Christ. And even in those ways of Jeremiah speaks to is that it's not a making things bearable for us, but it's actually moving things to be flourishing,
Right.
right? The welfare of this city, for when the city prospers, so too will you, and that's looking to the really kind of a broad, big picture. When you're in this place to seek and to see redemption come and reconciliation, and so when you are in those places it's through potentially us that's where it's coming from because of the way we're showing up and being kingdom kind of people.
Yeah, yeah, and in the simple everyday things
Yeah,
because Jesus or God is not telling his people like work your way into a place of authority in where you've been exiled or whatever. He's like plant gardens, build houses, live your life in that place that I've put you. And that it's so contrary to I don't know. I think it's contrary to what we expect justice to look like. Um, but that's an act of justice. And that doesn't mean that we don't also like stand up in loud ways when we see
sure.
blatant injustice around us or in front of us. And I'm not saying that we don't get involved in um, creating trying to create systems that offer more justice. I'm not saying any of that, but there is something about like this quiet persistence of like this one widow that just keeps showing up and she just keeps showing up. And there's something in that that's yeah, it's less about what I'm saying with my mouth and more about the way that I'm living life and showing up like Jesus.
Right. And maybe it's the posture that's where we're headed into next week, that makes sense that it lends itself into, yeah, it does matter how I show up. The even in those uh, yes, in some of the loud and upfront ways, but maybe more important in those quiet, everyday kind of moments, in the ways that we show up into spaces, that we walk into moments, that it's the mercy, the justice, and the walk humbly, right? The will this be how I orient and operate in my everyday life?
Right. Yeah. And it stands in contrast not only to a broken world where there is injustice, but it also stands in contrast to uh, what the church or Christians have long decided justice looks like.
Right.
And yeah, I think so did Jesus when he showed up. And that I know we both talked or shared this story, like Moshe's story, which is this man who's essentially he's a Jewish man who's saying like, "Hey, I've been taught, and I when I read scripture, it says that if the Messiah comes, the world's going to look a certain way, and it doesn't look like that." And for Jewish people, a lot of times or the idea of the Messiah is actually this period of time that where things should look different. The kingdom should be really obvious and breaking through in really obvious ways. And so the call out of like, you're telling me the Messiah is here, but I'm not seeing God's people show up the way I would expect them to. And I think that's what Jesus did was like, hey, you thought I was going to come in this way, and I didn't. And I'm reading Messy Spirituality off of your recommendation
Mike
right now.
Yaconelli.
Yeah,
That's
and
the
that's one of the things he talks about in there, and he talks about the script that existed for the Messiah and the religious leaders of the time when Jesus shows up. He's like, they had a script, and Jesus showed up, and he wasn't playing by the rules. Like he didn't fit their script, and he's like, and Mike is calling out like the Messiah, doesn't do this and doesn't do this and doesn't do that. And Jesus basically responds and says, well, I do. Like, this is what it is. And that's where I sense maybe for us in this space and time is like not only are followers of Jesus called to stand against the injustice and the brokenness in the world. That's true, and that's always been true. But we also find ourselves, and this is not new either, but in a specific kind of way, we also find ourselves in a space where we're having to stand against what the script that the church has written for themselves that doesn't look like what I see God call his people to in scripture all the time. And so that's where the quietness that and I don't know, that's landing, I guess, for me now. I didn't have it in that phrase on Sunday, but a quiet justice of like, do I recognize that every time I show up looking like Jesus, that actually is an act of justice?
Yeah. Was that your Kairos?
Maybe. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, well, yes. And then again, I didn't have that language on Sunday, but I even was having a conversation yesterday with somebody who was there Sunday, and she said, um, she was like, that Sunday's message was challenging for me. And she's in a rough work environment and has been for a while. She leads a nonprofit that's supposed to be Christian, faith-based nonprofit, which sometimes is a tricky place to lead because people don't always look like Jesus in those places when
Right.
you would expect them to. And so the conversation we were having yesterday was even around this. And again, I didn't maybe necessarily have that language or that perspective of like that is a quiet justice, but she was calling out. She said that Sunday felt challenging because it felt like this idea of like it actually doesn't matter how the people around you are treating you. I want you to pray for the good. I want you to work for the good of the place I've put you and called you. And so she's like, if I feel called to be where I'm at, which I do right now, then I actually like my job in this space is to work for the good of the organization and even people who aren't treating me well and who where it's not super easy to do that. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, the quiet justice.
Yeah.
What's yours?
Um, I would say right now it's in this invitation to, with persistence and faithfulness, to pray and to seek God's direction and favor and God's justice in places that I don't see it, and to trust that God will bring. Right. And I think I'm reflecting in that the judge is like, no, I'm good. And then finally relents. And then Jesus' statement, like, if the judge will relent, will God not show up? Will he not bring justice? And so it's that being in a place of trusting God. But will I persist in my communion with him and my prayer with him and my seeking after him? Will I persist versus, and I think I go back to that, what I offered earlier in the podcast was like, there's a tendency sometimes to sit in a place of like, I guess that's the norm.
Hmm.
Nah, not if it's broken, not if
Yeah.
it's not kingdom. It's not. And I'm convicted that I in times can be resigned to the fact that like, I guess that's just how it's going to be. Right. This fatalist kind of deal. And then I'm convicted in the Kairos from years. I don't see that in this parable. She is not resigned to
Yeah.
like to that. So why I don't want to be. I want when Jesus comes back to like, here's here's the faith. Here's the faith of someone who was willing to persist and seek after me
Hmm.
in ways that the redemption needed to come. Reconciliation was an opportunity and a place for it to come. And you persisted.
Yeah. It's good.
Yeah. Well, guys, thanks for joining us and listening in to Beyond Sunday podcast. We hope and pray that your conversations are going beyond Sunday and what God is leading you in, what the text is offering us, and maybe in your everyday life, what Jesus is inviting you into. So have a great week.